The train had been slowing for a long while before anyone in the boxcar let himself believe it. There had been false stops before. Water towers. Sidings in the middle of nothing, where the cars sat for an hour while a freight went by in the other direction, and the men inside listened to it pass like a river going somewhere better. So when the brakes began to bite again on that afternoon in the summer of 1943, nobody stood up. 29 German soldiers stayed exactly where they were, sitting on their kit and on the floor and against the ribbed wooden wall, and they waited to be disappointed one more time. Lorenz Bruckner was 22 years old and had not seen a fence in 11 days, which is a strange thing to notice, and he noticed it anyway. Wire had been the background of his life since Tunisia. Wire around the collection point at Enfidaville. Wire around the transit cage outside Oran, where the sun came down like a hand pressing on the top of your skull, and men fainted standing up. Wire on the dock. Wire at the camp in Scotland where they were deloused and photographed and given numbers, and where a Polish sergeant looked at Bruckner's face for a long moment and then said nothing at all, which was worse than anything he could have said. Then the ship, then Halifax, then this train, going west and west and west, until west stopped meaning a direction and started meaning a kind of joke. The brakes tightened. The couplings slammed forward down the length of the train, one after another, the sound running past them and away. Somebody swore softly. And then the car stopped and stayed stopped, and the engine up ahead let go of its steam in one long, exhausted breath, and outside, there were voices. Not shouting. That was the first wrong thing. In every place Bruckner had been taken so far, arrival meant shouting. It meant dogs and boots and men making noise on purpose, because noise is how you tell frightened people who is in charge. What he heard through the boards now was two men having a conversation. One of them laughed. Somebody's boots crunched on gravel. A door rolled back 3 cars up with a bang that made half the men in the car flinch, and then a voice said something in English in a completely ordinary tone, and another voice answered, and that was all. Feldwebel Kurt Seeloff was on his feet before the bolt came across. He always was. He was 34, a career man, Afrika Korps from the beginning, and he had spent the entire voyage reminding everyone within earshot that they were still soldiers, and that soldiers stand. Straighten up, he said. Whatever it is out there, we meet it standing. Wilhelm Anders did not straighten up. Anders was 41, a typesetter from Leipzig with a knee that had been ruined at Sidi Rezeg, and he had spent the crossing with his back against the wall reading the same water-swollen copy of a Karl May novel he had traded a razor for. He had opinions about standing. He kept most of them to himself. The bolt came across. The door rolled. And the light came in. You have to understand what 11 days in a boxcar does to your eyes. The light came through the gaps in the boards and bars, so you always had some idea of the sun, but you never had it whole. When that door opened, the whole sky came in at once, and every man in there put his hand up like he'd been struck. Behind the light, a shape. A Canadian sergeant, middle-aged, sleeves rolled, holding a clipboard against his hip. He looked at them the way a man looks at a delivery he has been expecting since morning. "All right," he said. "Down you come. Bring your gear." Nobody moved. He waited a second, then made a small gesture with 2 fingers. "Come on," the gesture you'd use on a slow dog or a shy child. Bruckner went first, mostly because he was closest to the door, and the men behind him were pressing. He hung off the edge, dropped, and his boots hit dirt and cinders, and something soft under that, and he straightened up, and he looked around for the camp. He looked for the camp for a long time. There was a track. There was a low wooden platform, more of a loading dock, and a shed with a tin roof. There was a truck with its tailgate down, and a soldier sitting on it with his rifle across his knees like a fishing rod. There were pine trees, dark and close, standing along the edge of everything, and beyond the pine there were more pine, and behind that, hills, blue and soft with distance, going on in a way that hurt to look at. And then there was the camp. Long, low buildings with tar paper roofs. A cookhouse with a stovepipe already going. A washhouse with barrels lined up outside catching sun on the water. A pole with a Canadian flag on it hanging dead in the still air. No towers, no searchlights, no dog runs, no wire. Bruckner turned all the way around, a complete circle, boots grinding in the cinders, because he was certain he had simply been facing the wrong way. The man behind him walked into his back. "Move," the man said. Bruckner didn't move. He raised one hand and pointed at the tree line, and then swept it slowly along the whole horizon, and he still didn't say anything, because he could not find the German for what he was trying to ask. Within about 4 minutes there were 60 men standing in that yard with their bundles at their feet, and not one of them was looking at the buildings. They were all doing the same thing. Turning. Scanning. Checking the edges of the world the way you check your pockets for keys. You know you had a minute ago. Somebody near the back said it out loud, in German, quietly, the way you'd ask a question in a church. "Where is the camp?" And a corporal from Bremen, a man Bruckner had never spoken to in his life, answered him without turning around. "You're in it." A few men laughed. It came out wrong. It came out high and short and got cut off, because laughing at it meant accepting it, and none of them were ready to accept it. Here is what offense does, and I don't think you understand it until it's gone. Offense tells you where you are. It draws the line between you and everything else, and yes, it's the line that keeps you in. But it's also the line that tells you the rules. Inside this line, this is what happens to you. Outside this line is somebody else's problem. Every one of those men had spent months, some of them years, arranging his entire inner life around a line like that. Take it away, and you don't feel free. You feel like you've been dropped through the floor. A tall Bavarian named Emil Rice said what everyone else was thinking. He said it to a Canadian private who was walking past with a clipboard of his own, and he said it in the broken English he'd picked up in Scotland, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. "You mean we can just walk?" The private stopped. He was young, 20 maybe, with a bad shaving rash on his throat. He looked at Rice, and then he looked out at the trees where Rice was pointing, and you could see him honestly trying to work out what the question was. "Sure," he said. "Walk around the camp all you like. Just don't be a nuisance about it." Rice stared at him. "There is no fence." And the private shrugged. Not a cruel shrug. Not a smug one. A shrug like a man being asked why he doesn't lock his shed. "Well," he said, "where would you go?" Then he walked off to do whatever he had been doing. Bruckner said later, decades later, that if that boy had sneered when he said it, the whole camp would have been fine. Fine, in the sense that the men would have known what to do with it. A sneer is a thing you can carry. A sneer gives you something to be angry at, and anger is fuel, and men in cages run on it. He didn't sneer. He was just genuinely puzzled. He had been asked a stupid question, and he'd given the obvious answer and gone back to work, and 60 German soldiers stood in a Manitoba clearing feeling the floor go out from under them. Where would you go? They were counted. Of course they were counted. The paperwork was thorough, and the Canadians were not fools, whatever the men thought that first afternoon. Names, ranks, numbers, all of it read out and checked against a list, and the sergeant with the clipboard did it in a flat voice and got most of the German pronunciations roughly right, which nobody expected. Then they were shown their barracks, and the barracks were the second shock. Bunks with blankets folded on them. Actual blankets, 3 to a man, gray wool, clean. A stove in the middle of the room with a wood box beside it already full. Windows. Real windows with glass in them and no bars, and the glass was clean, and on the wall by the door, a sheet of paper with a schedule written out in pencil in a careful hand. Breakfast, roll call, work parties, dinner, wash rotation, sick parade, Tuesdays and Fridays, 800. Bruckner stood in front of that piece of paper for a long time. Rice came and stood beside him. What's it say? Meals, Bruckner said. Work. When to wash. And? That's all. What do you mean, that's all? I mean, that's all, Bruckner said. There's nothing about what happens if we don't. That night, nobody slept properly. The barracks made noises, the way new buildings do when the day's heat leaves them, and every crack of a cooling nail sounded like something starting. Men got up in the dark and went to the window and looked out, and then went back to their bunks, and then 20 minutes later somebody else would get up and do exactly the same thing. Bruckner did it twice, both times the same view. Grass silver with moon, the black wall of the pines, one yellow window in the guardhouse, and between him and all of it, nothing at all. He lay there listening to Siloff, 3 bunks down, whispering to 2 other men. It's a trick, Siloff was saying. Understand me, it is a trick, and it has a purpose. They want us calm, and they want us working. That is all this is. And from further along, in the dark, Anders's voice, dry as a page turning. Feldwebel, if it's a trick, it's a very expensive one. They've given us butter. Somebody laughed. Siloff didn't. The camp sat on a lake in a national park, up in the high country of western Manitoba, where the prairie stops pretending to be flat, and heaves itself up into a plateau of aspen and spruce and black water. The Canadians had put the men there for a simple reason, and it had nothing to do with mercy. There was a fuel shortage. There was cordwood standing in that park by the 100,000 cords, and there were no Canadian men left to cut it, because the Canadian men were in Italy and Britain and the North Atlantic. So they took soldiers of the Africa Corps, men who 8 months earlier had been fighting for Tunis, and they gave them axes and swede saws and sent them into the bush to cut firewood for Winnipeg. Read that back. They gave them axes. That was the third shock, and for Bruckner it was the one that broke something loose. 4 days in, a work party of 16 was marched down a cut line to a stand of spruce, and at the end of the walk a Canadian corporal opened a wooden crate and started handing out tools. Bruckner took his axe and stood holding it, and the weight of it in his hands made him feel sick. He looked at the corporal. The corporal was 10 meters away with his rifle slung over his shoulder, muzzle down, and he had turned his back to fill his pipe. 16 armed men, 1 rifle, facing the wrong way. Rice caught his eye. Neither of them said anything. Rice's jaw was working. They cut wood. They cut wood all day, badly at first, because most of them were tank men and signalmen and drivers and had never swung an axe in their lives, and a Canadian bushman named Dufresne walked up and down the line correcting their grip and their stance with the patient contempt of a man watching amateurs ruin good timber. By noon, Bruckner had blisters that had already burst. By evening, he had stopped thinking about the corporal's back entirely, and only realized that on the walk home, and it frightened him more than the axe had. The quota was 1/3 of a cord a day, per man, 50 cents for meeting it, paid in canteen coupons. You could buy tobacco with it, and razor blades and stamps. Stamps. That is the detail I keep coming back to, because it's the one that makes the whole thing real. These men wrote letters, twice a month, on printed forms, censored both ways, going by ship across an ocean full of U-boats crewed by their own countrymen to towns that in some cases had already stopped existing. Bruckner wrote to his mother in Bremen every time he was allowed to. He wrote that he was well. He wrote that the food was good, which was true, and which he suspected she would not believe. He did not write about the fence, because he had tried once, in his first letter, and had sat for 10 minutes over the sentence "There is no wire here," and had finally crossed it out, because he could not think of a way to write it that did not sound like a lie or a boast or a code. I want to stop on that for a second because those letters are the reason we know any of this. Men like Bruckner survived on paper long before they survived in memory. A form with a camp number stamped on it. A censor's initials in blue pencil. A photograph with 3 names written on the back and no explanation of who the 4th man is. Most families have a box like that somewhere, and usually the person who could explain it is the person whose funeral put it in your hands. That's what my book, Find Your Grandfather's War is for. It's in the description. A plain guide to taking one name, one photograph, and a drawer of objects nobody labeled, and turning them back into a service record you can actually read. If that box exists in your house, start with it. Because paper is how these camps ran. Not wire. Paper. Every man in that camp was on a list in Ottawa, and a copy of that list existed in Geneva, and the Canadians knew, with a kind of bureaucratic serenity that the Germans found completely alien, that a man who walks into the bush is still on the list. He is just temporarily somewhere else on it. By the third week, the men had begun to talk about the fence less and think about it more. That is the thing about an absence. It doesn't stay interesting. It goes quiet, and it goes deep. In the second week, you point at it. In the third week, you stop pointing and you start doing arithmetic. Rice did the arithmetic out loud one afternoon in September, on a farm outside the park where a dozen prisoners had been lent out for the harvest. He and Bruckner were stacking sacks of oats onto a wagon, and the guard was 40 or 50 meters off, sitting on a fence rail with the farmer, and the two of them were laughing about something. "Look at him," Rice said. "I see him. He couldn't stop us. If we went now, into that shelter belt, he couldn't stop us. He'd have to shout first, and by the time he'd finished shouting, we'd be through the trees." Bruckner threw a sack up onto the stack. "And then?" Rice didn't answer. "Say it," Bruckner said. "Say the next part." "You know the next part." "Then say it." Rice stood there with a sack of oats on his shoulder and looked west across a field of stubble that ran out to a horizon with nothing on it. Not a spire, not a roof, not a road. Just the curve of the earth, unbothered. "The next part is 1,000 kilometers, he said. 2,000 to a coast. And which coast? And no papers. And no papers, and no coat, and no map, and no German for 3,000 kilometers in any direction, and the first person who hears you say a sentence out loud picks up a telephone." Rice put the sack down on the stack, carefully, and squared it up. Then he said, in a completely different voice, "I hate this." "Hate what?" "I hate that they're right." That was the whole camp in 4 words, and it took most of them months to arrive at it. Anders had got there in the first week. He usually did. He was on light duty because of his knee, which mostly meant sorting and stacking in the yard and arguing with people. And one evening he sat on the step of the barracks with a mug of tea he'd learned to drink the Canadian way, with milk in it, and laid it out for Bruckner like a man setting type. "You keep asking what the fence is for," Anders said. "Wrong question. Ask what a fence does." "It stops men leaving." "No. Almost never. Men get over wire all the time. In Europe, they get over wire twice a week." He blew on the tea. "A fence tells a man where the danger starts. That's its real work. It says, cross here, and something terrible happens to you. And a man measures that terrible thing against his freedom, and sometimes he decides it's worth it, and he goes. So take the wire away." Anders gestured out at the dark. "Where does the danger start now?" Bruckner looked out at the tree line. He didn't answer. "Exactly," Anders said. "It doesn't start anywhere. It's everywhere and it's nowhere and it's 400 kilometers deep. They haven't removed the wall, Bruckner. They've made it so big you can't see it from the inside." He drank his tea. "That's not kindness," he said. "Don't ever make the mistake of thinking it's kindness. It's confidence. It's the most arrogant thing I've ever seen in my life, and I've served under Italian generals." Seeloff had a different reading, and Seeloff had the numbers. There were men in that camp who had not stopped being soldiers of the Reich for 1 hour, and they organized, the way they organized in every camp in Canada and every camp anywhere else. They held their own roll calls. They ran their own courts. They decided which men were reliable and which men were becoming, in the word they used, soft. And in a camp with no wire and no towers and almost no guards inside the compound at night, The men who ran the barracks after lights out were not Canadians. This is the part that gets left out of the pleasant version of this story, so let's not leave it out. In October, a man in Hut 3 named Palka started attending the English lessons that a Canadian YMCA volunteer had begun running on Thursday evenings. Innocent enough. Half the camp went at first, out of boredom. Then fewer went, and then fewer, and everyone understood why without anyone saying it, and Palki kept going. One night in November, he came back from the wash house with his mouth broken and his front teeth gone, and he told the medical orderly that he had slipped on the ice. Nobody had slipped on the ice. The Canadians knew what was happening. They knew it in Ottawa. In 2 other camps that same year, men were beaten to death by their own comrades over exactly this, and there were hangings afterward, and none of it made the newspapers in any way that stuck. So when I tell you the camp had no fence, understand what I'm actually telling you. The Canadians had removed one wall, and the prisoners had built another one inside it, out of themselves, and the second wall was in some ways the more dangerous of the two. Bruckner said years later that the safest he ever felt in that camp was out in the bush at 40 below with an axe, and the least safe he ever felt was in bed. Emil Rice walked away on the 9th of December. He did not plan it. That's what everyone got wrong about it afterward, including Rice. There was no map sewn into a jacket, no hoarded bread, no compass filed out of a razor. There was a work party on a hall road on a gray morning, and Rice went behind a brush pile to relieve himself, and then he simply kept walking. He said later he wanted to see what it felt like. He said he got about 200 meters before the trees closed behind him and the sound of the saws went out, and that the silence that replaced it was the loudest thing he had ever heard in his life. They noticed at the count before lunch. The corporal in charge did not shout. He counted again, said a word under his breath, and sent a man on a horse back down the road to the camp. That was the entire alarm. No siren, no dogs. A man on a horse, at a trot, in no particular hurry. The camp found out at supper and did not stop talking about it for 2 days. Half the men were certain he'd make it. Not to Germany, nobody was mad, but to the border. It's a straight run south, someone said. 150 kilometers, maybe 200, and America was neutral. Which it had not been for 2 years, and somebody pointed that out, and the first man said it anyway, because that rumor had been traveling around the Canadian camps since 1940, and nothing kills a good rumor. The other half said he'd be dead by Friday. December in that country is not a season, it is a verdict. Seeloff was the loudest. Seeloff went from bunk to bunk that night with his eyes bright, saying that Rice had done what all of them should have done, that one man had remembered his oath, that the Canadians would now have to show their real face, and everyone would finally see this camp for what it was. Bruckner lay on his bunk and listened, and felt nothing but a low, sick worry about his friend's boots. Rice had bad boots. He'd been complaining about them for a month. Reese came back on the 11th, in a truck, sitting between 2 Canadian soldiers with a gray blanket around his shoulders, and the whole camp came out to watch. Here is what had happened, and nobody could invent it. He had gone south and slightly east through the bush for most of a day and had done reasonably well, all things considered, until the cold got into him. That first night he did not sleep so much as pass in and out of things. In the morning his feet had stopped being feet in any useful sense, and he came out of the trees onto a road because he had to, and he followed it because there was nothing else. And by mid-morning he came to a place where the road met another road, and there was a store. A general store, with a gas pump outside and a stovepipe going and a woman behind the counter. Reese went in because he was going to die if he didn't. He stood in the warm, and the woman looked up at him, a stranger in an army greatcoat dyed the wrong color with a big red circle on the back, which is what the Canadians used instead of a fence. A patch on your clothes that said, in the plainest possible terms, that you were nobody's neighbor. He put money on the counter. Real German coins from his pocket, which he had carried across an ocean and had never once spent, and which he was now offering for bread and something hot. The woman looked at the coins for a while. Then she came around the counter, took him by the elbow, put him in a chair by the stove, and gave him a bowl of soup. And while he ate it, she went to the wall at the back of the store, and she picked up the telephone, and she called the police. She did not hide it from him. She was 3 meters away. He heard the whole call. And when she was finished, she came back and refilled the bowl. Rice said afterwards that of everything that happened to him in 5 years of war, that was the moment he could not get out of his head. Not the shelling at Mersa Matruh, not the ship. That woman, filling the bowl a second time, having already made the call, with no more malice in her than a person putting out water for a dog. The camp watched him climb down out of the truck. He got down on his own. His face was raw and one hand was bandaged, and he looked, more than anything, embarrassed. They were waiting for the punishment. Every man in that yard was waiting for it, and part of every man in that yard wanted it, because punishment would have made sense of the last 5 months. The commandant came down the steps of the orderly room. He was a heavy, unhurried man in his 50s, who had left a leg's worth of function behind at Passchendaele, and who had been given this posting because of it. He stopped in front of Rice and looked at him for a while. Then he said, in English, and someone translated it in a murmur down the ranks, "Enjoy your holiday?" A couple of the guards grinned. Rice looked at the ground and said, "No, sir." "Cold out?" "Yes, sir." "Feet all right?" Rice didn't answer that one. The commandant turned to the orderly sergeant. "Get him to the M.O., then get him something hot. He's on regular detail Monday." And he went back up the steps, and that was the end of it. 28 days' loss of canteen privileges came through on paper a week later. That was the entire sentence. 28 days without tobacco. Bruckner watched Silof's face during all of it, and he said it was the only time in 2.5 years that he saw the man genuinely at a loss. Silof had needed a beating. He had needed a public one, in the yard, in front of everybody, because that beating would have proved that the Reich was right about this country, and about this war, and about what men are. And instead, an old Canadian with a bad leg asked a frozen Bavarian whether he'd enjoyed his holiday, and sent him to see the doctor. You cannot organize anything around that. There is nothing to push against. It's like throwing a punch into a room with no walls, which was, in the end, the entire point. That night in the barracks, one of Silof's men said the obvious thing. He said it loudly, to the room. They are pretending. They want the wood cut. They want the farms in. They want us docile, and they have found a cheaper way to do it than wire, and every one of you is falling for it. And a man from Hut 2, a mechanic named Gallner, who had said perhaps 40 words since Halifax, sat up and said, "Fine, then it's working. What are you going to do about it?" Nobody had an answer, and that silence went on too long, and after that the room changed. Not all at once, but it changed. Winter took the valley properly in January. 40 below in the mornings, the kind of cold that stops being weather and starts being an opinion about your right to exist. Bruckner learned that spit freezes before it lands. He learned to breathe through a scarf and to never touch a saw blade with a bare hand, and to check another man's face for the white patches he couldn't feel on his own. The Canadians issued them Mackinaw coats and mitts and felt boots, and the men who had come out of the desert with sand still in the seams of their paybooks stood in a Manitoba forest in a foot of snow and cut cordwood, 10 hours a day, and hit their quota. And the fence still wasn't there. That was the thing. It was somehow more absurd in the snow. The whole camp under a meter of white, smoke going straight up from 6 stovepipes, and the buildings sitting in that open country not like a prison at all, but like a little village that somebody had lost. In February, they flooded a patch of the lake ice and made a rink, because a Canadian guard suggested it, and because there was nothing else to do. Somebody produced skates, God knows how. The men played a version of hockey that Dufresne the Bushman described as the worst thing he had ever witnessed, and then he laced up and joined in. Children came from the farms. That was the part that undid people. 2 or 3 at a time, then a half dozen, standing at the edge of the ice in their snowsuits, watching grown men fall over. One of them, a boy of about 9 with an Icelandic name that Bruckner never learned to spell, asked Dufresne straight out whether these were the prisoners. Dufresne said they were. The boy watched them for another minute, and then said, "They just look like guys." He didn't mean anything by it. He was 9. Bruckner heard it and understood it, because his English by then was good enough, and he had to go and stand behind the warming shack for a while. He tried to explain it once, long afterwards, and made a mess of it, and then said this: for 4 years, everything that had happened to him had depended on him being a category. He was the enemy. He was the Africa Corps. He was a prisoner. He was a number on a list. He was a red circle on the back of a coat. A category is survivable. You can be a category and still be intact underneath it. And then a child looked at him for 30 seconds and dismantled the whole apparatus with 5 words, and he had absolutely no defense against it, because it had never occurred to anyone to prepare him for kindness delivered by accident. Not everyone got the accident. There was a woman on the road toward the town, a widow with a half section and a hired girl, and prisoners went to her place twice for haying. She never spoke to them. She put the water bucket down at the end of the row and walked back to the house. Bruckner assumed she hated them, and then in the second summer the hired girl told one of the guards, who told somebody else, and it came around the camp the way these things did. Her son had been in the Winnipeg Grenadiers. He had gone to Hong Kong in November of 1941, which meant he had been a prisoner of the Japanese since Christmas Day of that year, and she had received 1 printed card in 20 months. That was all. 1 card, with boxes ticked. She put the water bucket down at the end of the row every single time. Bruckner thought about that woman for the rest of his life. He said she taught him more about what a country actually is than any speech he ever heard on either side of the ocean. She had every reason in the world, and she put the bucket down anyway, and she did not stay to be thanked, because she wasn't doing it for them. Her son died in a camp in Japan in 1944, unloading ships. She found out in 1945. The war ended in Europe on a Tuesday in May, and the camp heard it on the radio in the guardhouse, and then from the guards themselves, who came in and told them without gloating, which by then nobody found remarkable anymore. Then came June, and the films. The Canadians showed them the newsreels. Not all camps did it the same way, and there are arguments about it to this day, but in that camp, they set up a projector in the recreation hut, and they ran the footage from Belsen and Buchenwald, and attendance was not optional. Bruckner never described what was in the film, in any interview, ever. He was asked more than once. He would say only that he had walked in believing it was propaganda, because that is what all of them believed, and that he had walked out 90 minutes later having stopped believing it about halfway through, and that the second half was the worst hour of his life. Seeloff stood up in the middle and shouted that it was staged. 2 men pulled him back down. Not guards. Germans. Afterwards the hut emptied and the men went out into a June evening that was still light at 10 o'clock, and stood around in the open ground of a camp with no fence in it, and did not talk to each other. And this is the part I have never been able to shake. Every man in that yard was now standing in a country that had gone out of its way to feed him, house him, doctor him, pay him 50 cents a day, and put no wire around him at all, having just watched what his own side had done to men in wire. Anders, the typesetter, sat down on the step of Hut 1 and put his hands over his face and stayed like that for a long time. And when Bruckner sat down next to him, Anders finally said, without moving his hands, "They knew. When they built this place. They already knew what it would look like next to ours." That was not true, as it happens. In 1943, the Canadians building a wood-cutting camp in a national park were thinking about fuel oil and manpower, not about history. But I understand why he needed it to be true. They went home in 1946, most of them, which took a great deal longer than any of them expected, and the route ran through England and more work and more waiting, because the ruins of Europe needed hands. Bruckner got to Bremen in the spring of 1947 and walked from the station toward his mother's street, and could not find the street, because the street was not there, and he stood in a field of brick with a cardboard suitcase, 26 years old, having come 9,000 kilometers. She was alive. She was in 2 rooms in a suburb with another family. She had kept every letter he sent, in a biscuit tin, in order. And here is how the story actually ends, and it's the reason I wanted to tell it at all. By 1947, the Canadian government was receiving applications from former German prisoners of war asking to be allowed to come back. Not a handful. Thousands. Men who had been shipped to that country in the holds of troop ships as enemies wrote from bombed-out cities, asking whether there was room, and whether the farmer at such and such a section still needed a hand, and in a great many cases the farmer wrote a letter of support. Somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 of them made it back, by most counts. The records are messy. That is what records are. Bruckner came back in 1951. He worked 2 seasons in the bush he had been marched into as a prisoner, cutting the same kind of timber for a wage instead of coupons. And then he bought land north of Dauphin with a partner, and he married a woman whose parents had come from Ukraine in 1912, and who spoke 3 languages, none of them well, and they had 4 children. In 1963 he put a fence around his home quarter, page wire, cedar posts, to keep his cattle off the road. His daughter told an interviewer that her father stood at the end of the driveway when it was finished and laughed until he had to sit down on the tailgate and would not explain why, and that when she asked him about it as an adult, he said only that he had spent 2.5 years waiting for somebody to build that fence, and had finally had to do it himself. He was asked, near the end of his life, what he remembered most clearly. He was in his 80s by then, and a lot of it had gone soft at the edges. The desert had gone. Whole months of the war had gone. He said he could not reliably remember the faces of men he had served beside for 2 years. But he could still see the boxcar door. He could see the light coming in all at once, and 60 men putting their hands up, and the sergeant with the clipboard on his hip making that small 2-fingered gesture. He could see himself dropping down into the cinders and turning in a full circle looking for the wall, and not finding it, and the specific cold feeling in his stomach when he understood that nobody was going to build one. He said the men in that yard had been told all their lives that order comes from walls, and that a country holds itself together by frightening its people, and that the entire structure of that idea came apart on a summer afternoon in Manitoba, quietly, without a single shot, because a 20-year-old private with a shaving rash had shrugged and asked them where exactly they thought they were going to go. And he said that the thing he had been most afraid of, that first night, lying in a clean bunk under 3 gray blankets in a building with unbarred windows, was not the wilderness, and not the winter, and not the guards. It was the road. The plain dirt road running out of the camp toward the town, empty in the moonlight, with nothing on it and nothing across it and nobody watching it. Because a locked gate asks nothing of you. You can spend years behind a locked gate and never once have to find out what you would actually choose. An open road asks you the question every single morning, and keeps asking, and does not accept silence as an answer. It took him most of a lifetime to say it in one sentence, and this was the sentence. He had gone to Canada expecting to be imprisoned, and instead he had been left alone with the difference between getting out and being free, and he had never entirely got over the discovery that they were not the same thing.